Why was she counting oscillations that no one else could hear? Seat 34B wasn't just uncomfortable. It was designed that way. Lyra Haldon sat compressed into economy class, her knees jammed against the plastic tray table, listening to something wrong. The Pratt& Whitney engines hummed beneath her, but there was a vibration, a micro-frequency in the lower register. The kind most people would never notice. The kind she'd trained herself to recognize 6 years ago, over the Syrian border when her F-22's engine started failing mid-combat. But nobody on this plane knew that. Nobody saw past the gray hoodie, the worn sneakers, the woman without makeup squeezed into the back row, invisible. Around her, the mundane choreography of commercial flight played out exactly as it always did. A toddler smeared chocolate on the window. A businessman typed aggressively, his laptop encroaching on her armrest. Flight attendants moved through the aisle with practiced smiles that barely hid their contempt for the cargo they served. And Lyra sat there, silent, counting the irregular vibrations from the wing tip visible through scratched plexiglass. She wasn't complaining. Marines don't complain, they adapt. To her left, a man coughed without covering his mouth, droplets caught in the harsh beam of the reading light. To her right, a teenager blasted music so loud it bled through his cheap headphones, creating a discordant soundtrack to her rising anxiety. The air conditioning vent above her head was broken, stuck closed, creating a stagnant pocket of heat that made her hoodie feel like a suffocating second skin. But she refused to take it off. It was armor. The only kind she had against the judging eyes of a world that valued appearance over substance. Every time the beverage cart clattered past, it struck her shoulder. A dull thud. The flight attendant pushing it didn't even apologize. Lyra's body was just another obstacle in the narrow, friction-filled ecosystem of economy class. 10 minutes earlier, the preview of what was coming had played out over the overhead bins. A man in a bespoke suit, clearly lost on his way back from business class, had paused at row 34. He eyed the overhead compartment where Lyra's battered duffel bag was stowed. Without asking, he popped the latch and began forcibly shoving her bag aside to make room for his oversized leather garment bag, crushing her soft-sided luggage against the metal track. When Lyra quietly placed a hand on his wrist to stop him, explaining that her bag contained fragile medical equipment for her mother, he recoiled. Like she was diseased. He wiped his wrist with a sanitizer wipe, sneering that checked luggage exists for people who can't afford space. Then he slammed the bin shut, nearly catching her fingers. The flight attendant nearby watched the entire exchange, said nothing to the man, but reprimanded Lyra for blocking the aisle when she stood up to check if her equipment was broken. That's how it worked up here, in the clouds, where money bought silence, where appearance bought respect, where a woman in economy was worth less than the luggage she carried. But then the vibration changed, and everything else stopped mattering. It wasn't a violent drop. It was a shudder that rippled through the floorboards, vibrating up through the soles of Lyra's worn sneakers. A specific tactile sensation she'd felt before. A compressor stall beginning to propagate. The feeling she remembered from that mission over Syria, when her wingman's aircraft had lost an engine, and she'd talked him through an emergency landing while taking enemy fire. The rest of the cabin barely paused their conversations. Clear air turbulence, they assumed. A bump, nothing to worry about. Lyra's body went rigid. Combat instincts flooded her system with adrenaline, but she didn't gasp, didn't grip the armrests. Instead, she unbuckled her seatbelt with a seamless fluid motion that went unnoticed by the man next to her. She stood up, her center of gravity low and balanced, scanning the ceiling panels where the hydraulic lines ran. The vibration was traveling from the port side, confirming her suspicion. Pressure imbalance in the number 1 engine. She moved into the aisle, her face a mask of professional detachment, ignoring the fastened seatbelt light that blinked on with a cheerful, ignorant chime. As she moved forward, the contrast between the cabins became visceral, a physical assault on her senses. The carpet under her feet changed from threadbare gray to plush deep navy that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. The air grew cooler, filtered, scented with something floral to mask the smell of jet fuel. Passengers here weren't jammed shoulder to shoulder. They were sprawled in lie-flat pods, sipping champagne from real glass flutes that caught the sunlight, blissfully unaware that the physics keeping their luxury aloft were rapidly disintegrating. Lyra passed a man asleep with a sleep mask that cost more than her monthly rent, his mouth open in a snore of total security, a stark reminder of the dangerous illusion that money could insulate you from the laws of aerodynamics. She paused near the galley to listen to the turbine pitch, but a trolley carrying hot towels blocked her path. She asked the flight attendant for a bottle of water. Her throat was parched from the dry air and the rising adrenaline, but the woman didn't even look up from her inventory list. "Water is for service round 2, she said, turning her back to arrange a tray of smoked salmon canapés for the front row. When Lyra pointed to a stack of water bottles sitting right there on the counter, the flight attendant snatched them away, placing them on a higher shelf like she was protecting gold bullion from a thief. "Those are Evian," she stated, the implication hanging heavy in the air that Lyra's palate wasn't refined enough for premium hydration. "There's a tap in the lavatory if you're that desperate. Now move. I have paying customers who need their Chardonnay topped off." Then came Aquila Danner, the lead flight attendant. She intercepted Lyra at the partition between economy and business class, her body acting as a physical barricade reinforced by years of enforcing petty authority. Aquila was immaculate in her uniform, every hair sprayed into a helmet of perfection, her badge gleaming under the LED lights, but her eyes held profound disdain for the woman standing before her. She took in Lyra's appearance, the fraying aglets on her hoodie strings, the lack of makeup, the utility watch that looked cheap compared to the gold timepieces in the front rows, and she made a rapid class-based calculation. "The lavatories are in the back," Aquila said, her voice dripping with faux politeness that was more insulting than a slap. "And the seatbelt sign is on. You need to return to your seat immediately before you injure yourself or someone who actually paid for legroom." She didn't wait for a response, already turning her shoulder to dismiss Lyra, treating her like a wayward child who had wandered into an adults-only conversation. The dismissal was followed by a pointed, exaggerated sigh. Aquila picked up a linen napkin to wipe down a champagne flute, making a show of her busy, important work. The gesture was clear. Lyra was beneath her attention, an interruption, a nuisance. But Lyra didn't move. She stood there, feeling the vibration intensifying through the fuselage, hearing the pitch of the turbine climbing into dangerous territory. And she spoke quietly, calmly, with the measured tone of someone who had delivered bad news in combat briefings. "The left engine is failing. You need to alert the cockpit immediately." Aquila's face twisted, not with concern, with irritation, like Lyra had just told her the most absurd lie she'd ever heard. "Excuse me." Aquila stepped closer, invading Lyra's space, using her height and authority to intimidate. "Are you a pilot, an aircraft mechanic, or are you just another nervous passenger who watched too many disaster movies?" Lyra's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I'm telling you there's a compressor stall developing in the port turbine if they don't reduce throttle end." "Sit down." Aquila's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. Heads turned in first class. Passengers looked up from their tablets and cocktails, intrigued by the confrontation. "You're an economy passenger, not someone who can fix a cockpit. Now return to your seat before I have you restrained for interfering with crew duties." The words hung in the air, an insult delivered with surgical precision, designed to humiliate, to remind Lyra of her place, to make her feel small, powerless, invisible. And for a moment, Lyra considered walking away, going back to seat 34B, buckling in, letting the professionals handle it, because that's what the world expected from women like her: silence, compliance, invisibility. But then the plane lurched. A violent shudder that sent champagne glasses tumbling from tables. A flight attendant stumbled, catching herself on a seat back. And from the cockpit, through the open intercom that someone had accidentally left on, came a voice. Panicked, breathless, terrified. "We're losing hydraulic pressure. The left engine's spiking. I can't." The voice cut off, replaced by a high-pitched alarm that screamed through the cabin speakers, a sound every pilot recognized. Stall warning. Aquila's face went pale. Her superiority evaporated in an instant, replaced by the primal fear of someone who suddenly realized they were in a metal tube, 7 miles above the earth, and something was very, very wrong. Lyra didn't wait for permission this time. She moved past Aquila, striding toward the cockpit door with the purposeful gait of someone who had walked into burning buildings and hostile territory. Someone who didn't ask for approval. Someone who took action. But Aquila grabbed her arm, hard, nails digging into fabric. "You can't go up there, it's restricted, federal law." Lyra turned, looked down at the hand on her arm, then up at Aquila's face. And in that moment, there was something in Lyra's eyes that made the flight attendant's grip falter. Something cold, something dangerous, something forged in places where death wasn't a possibility but a constant companion. "Let go," Lyra said quietly, "or I'll make you." Aquila released her, stepping back, because whatever she saw in that woman's eyes, it wasn't the timid economy passenger she dismissed moments ago. Lyra reached the cockpit door just as another violent shudder rocked the plane. Passengers were screaming now. The polite veneer of first class shattered as people realized that money couldn't save them from gravity. She pounded on the reinforced door, her fist striking with controlled force. "Open the door, I can help." From inside, muffled through the thick barrier, came chaos, shouting, alarms, the frantic sound of men who had lost control and knew it. Then a voice, the captain, breathless, angry. "Who the hell is that?" "A passenger, sir. She says she can help." "Tell her to sit down. We're handling it." But they weren't handling it. Lyra could hear it in their voices, the panic, the disbelief, the paralysis that came when training failed and instinct took over. She'd heard it before, in young pilots, in men who froze when the bullets started flying. "You're in a stall," Lyra called through the door, her voice cutting through the chaos with military precision. "You're pulling back on the yoke. You need to push forward, reduce throttle on the left engine and compensate with the right. Now." Silence, then laughter, sharp, bitter, disbelieving. "Lady, I've been flying for 30 years. I don't need some random woman telling me how to fly my plane. Now get back to your seat before I have you arrested." Lyra closed her eyes, took a breath. The plane was shaking harder now, the engine screaming. She could feel the angle of descent changing, steepening. They were losing altitude fast. And then something happened that no one expected. The security panel beside the cockpit door beeped. Once, twice. The LED screen flickered to life, displaying a message in cold military font. Authorized Combat Pilot DETECTED. Cockpit access required. The door lock disengaged with a mechanical click, and the cockpit door swung open on its own. What just happened? The cockpit door stood open like an invitation, or a challenge, and for a moment nobody moved. Not the flight attendants frozen in the aisle, not the captain staring at the security panel in disbelief. Not even Lyra, who had triggered a military override system she didn't know existed on civilian aircraft. Then she stepped inside. The cockpit was chaos. Captain Briggs sat in the left seat, his hands white-knuckled on the yoke, pulling back with all his strength like he was trying to drag the plane into the sky through sheer force of will. His face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead, veins bulging in his neck. Beside him, First Officer Voss was hammering at the instrument panel, his voice climbing into a register that bordered on hysteria. "It's not responding. Nothing's responding. We're going down. Oh God, we're going down." Both men turned when Lyra entered, and their expressions shifted from panic to something else. Confusion, anger, indignation. "Get out," Briggs snarled. "This is a secure area, you can't be in here." Lyra didn't respond. Her eyes were already scanning the instrument panel. Engine 1 failing, hydraulic pressure dropping, altitude decreasing at 800 feet per minute, airspeed bleeding away. And there on the primary flight display, the angle of attack indicator was in the red. They were in a full stall. She moved to stand behind the captain's seat, her hand resting on the headrest, leaning forward to see the full picture. And that's when she understood. They were fighting the plane, pulling back when they should be pushing forward, increasing throttle when they should be reducing it. Every instinct they had was wrong. "You're in a deep stall," she said, her voice calm. "Matter of fact. You need to push the yoke forward and reduce power on the left engine. The compressor stall is creating asymmetric thrust. You're yawing left." Briggs didn't even look at her. "Voss, get her out of here." But Voss was frozen, his hands trembling on the control panel, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from realizing you were about to die, and there was nothing you could do about it. The plane dropped, a sickening lurch that sent Lyra's stomach into her throat. Screams erupted from the cabin behind her. The altitude indicator spun downward. 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. "Listen to me," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the alarms. "I'm a Marine pilot, F-22 Raptor. I've landed jets on one engine under enemy fire. I know what I'm doing. And if you don't let me help you right now, everyone on this plane is going to die." Briggs finally turned to look at her, really look at her, taking in the gray hoodie, the lack of uniform, the audacity of this woman standing in his cockpit telling him how to fly. "You're a Marine," he laughed, a bitter, desperate sound. "You don't look like a Marine, you look like a college kid. And even if you are, fighter jets and commercial aircraft are completely different. So unless you want to be responsible for killing 300 people, get out. Now." But Lyra didn't move, because something had shifted in Voss. He was looking at her with desperate hope, the kind of hope drowning men cling to when they see a rope. "Captain," Voss whispered, "we're at 2,000 feet, we're not recovering. Maybe we should listen to her." "Shut up, Voss." The plane shuddered violently. A sound like tearing metal echoed through the fuselage. The left engine was disintegrating. Pieces of turbine blade were being chewed up inside the cowling, creating vibrations that would soon tear the mounting bolts free. And when that happened, the engine would separate from the wing. And then there would be no recovery, only fire and falling. Lyra's military training took over. The part of her that had commanded squadrons, that had made life-and-death decisions in split seconds, that had been forged in heat and pressure until she was harder than the men who doubted her. She reached past Briggs and grabbed the yoke, her hand closing over his, and she pushed forward, hard. "What are you doing?" Briggs tried to fight her, pulling back against her grip, but Lyra's hands were strong, trained, and she had leverage. The nose of the plane dipped. Passengers screamed louder. It felt wrong. Every instinct said pulling up would save them, but instinct was a liar in a stall. The only way to recover was to dive, to trade altitude for airspeed, to accept the fall in order to regain control. "Trust me," Lyra said through gritted teeth. "Let the nose drop." Briggs was fighting her, his face red, veins bulging, and for a moment they were locked in a physical struggle, two people wrestling for control of a dying aircraft. The yoke shook between them. The plane groaned. The engine screamed. Then Voss did something that saved them all. He reached over and hit the disconnect button for Briggs' controls. The captain's yoke went limp in his hands. Useless. "What the hell are you doing?" Briggs roared. "Saving us," Voss said quietly. Then he looked at Lyra. "The aircraft is yours." Lyra didn't waste time with gratitude. She pushed the yoke forward, pitching the nose down into a controlled dive. Airspeed began to climb, 80 knots, 90, 100. The stall warning stopped screaming. The airflow over the wings became smooth again. The plane was flying. But they weren't out of danger yet. The left engine was still failing, still creating asymmetric thrust. Lyra's right hand moved to the throttle quadrant, pulling back on the left lever while advancing the right, compensating, balancing. "Rudder," she said to Voss. "I need right rudder to counteract the yaw." Voss's foot slammed down on the pedal. The plane straightened, no longer skidding sideways through the sky. Lyra scanned the instruments, altitude stabilizing at 1,000 feet, airspeed steady at 160 knots, hydraulic pressure holding. They were flying level. She had saved them, for now. But the left engine was done. It needed to be shut down before it destroyed itself completely. Lyra's hand moved to the fuel cutoff lever. "No," Briggs said. He had recovered his voice, his authority, his ego. "You're not shutting down my engine. We need both engines to land." "Your engine is eating itself," Lyra said, not arguing, just stating fact. "If I don't shut it down, it's going to throw a blade. And when that happens, it'll take out the fuel lines in the wing. Then we'll have a fire. And then we'll have an explosion. Is that what you want?" Briggs stared at her, jaw clenched, pride warring with survival instinct. Then he looked away, defeated. "Do it." Lyra pulled the fuel cutoff lever. The left engine spooled down, its tortured scream fading to silence. The vibration stopped. The plane flew smoother, quieter, like a wounded animal finally allowed to rest. She adjusted the trim, compensated for the loss of thrust, brought them into a stable configuration. Single engine, wings level, airspeed holding. They were going to make it. Behind her in the cabin, passengers were crying, praying, holding each other. The flight attendants were pale, gripping seatbacks, realizing how close they'd come to the edge. And somewhere in first class, Aquila Danner was staring at the open cockpit door, her world view shattered. Voss was the first to speak, his voice shaky but sincere. "Thank you, I don't know what would have happened if—" "You'd be dead," Lyra said simply. No emotion, just truth, all of you. Briggs still hadn't looked at her. His hands were trembling in his lap. The hands of a man who had just realized he wasn't the hero of this story, that his 3 decades of experience had been worthless when it mattered, that a woman in a gray hoodie had saved his life and he'd fought her every step of the way. "Who are you?" Voss asked quietly. Lyra finally allowed herself a breath. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but her hands were steady. Her voice was calm, because this was what she was trained for. This was who she was. Lieutenant Colonel Lyra Halden, United States Marine Corps, former commander of the 7th Fighter Squadron, call sign Reaper. The words hung in the air, and in that moment everything changed. The way Voss looked at her, the way even Briggs's shoulders sagged in something that might have been shame, because they suddenly understood. This wasn't some random passenger. This was a warrior, someone who flew aircraft that cost more than their salaries combined, someone who had commanded men in combat, someone who belonged in this seat more than either of them. But there was no time for apologies, no time for explanations, because the radio crackled to life. "Air traffic control, urgent. Flight 447, we've lost your transponder. What is your status?" Lyra reached for the microphone. Her voice was crisp, professional, the voice of someone who had called in airstrikes and coordinated rescue operations. "Tower, this is Lieutenant Colonel Halden, currently in command of Flight 447. We have experienced a catastrophic failure of the number 1 engine. Engine secured. Single-engine operations, requesting priority landing and emergency equipment standing by." Silence, then a different voice, older, authoritative. "Colonel Halden, is that? Ma'am, we're showing you as a passenger on that flight." "Affirmative. I've assumed command due to crew incapacitation." She glanced at Briggs and Voss. Neither corrected her. "We are stable but require immediate landing clearance." Understood, Colonel. You are cleared for immediate approach. Runway 27 left. Emergency equipment is rolling. Welcome back to the stick, ma'am. A hint of a smile touched Lyra's lips. Welcome back to the stick. That's what they used to say after a mission, when you landed safe, when you survived. She began the approach, calling out altitudes, configuring the flaps, lowering the gear, flying the aircraft with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times in aircraft far more complex than this lumbering commercial jet. And in the cabin behind her, passengers watched through the open cockpit door, watched this woman in the gray hoodie fly their plane with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who had always belonged there. Aquila stood in the galley, silent, her face pale, watching the woman she had dismissed, the woman she had insulted, the woman who was now saving all their lives. And she felt something she hadn't felt in years: shame. What were they thinking in those final moments before the ground? The runway lights stretched ahead like a path of jewels in the darkness. 2 miles. Then 1. Lyra's hands moved across the controls with practiced ease, calling out airspeeds and altitudes in the clipped, professional tone of someone who had done this under far worse conditions. 500 feet, 400, 300. The plane descended through the evening air, stable despite flying on one engine, despite everything it had been through. In the cabin, silence had replaced the screaming, a tense, breathless silence of people watching their lives hang in the balance, faces pressed against windows, hands gripping armrests, prayers whispered into the recycled air. They could see the runway now, close, so close. But something was wrong in first class, a different kind of chaos, the chaos of men whose egos couldn't accept what they were witnessing. Harlan Webb sat in seat 2A, his scotch spilled across his expensive slacks, his phone pressed to his ear as he shouted at someone on the other end. Someone important. Someone who could, in his mind, fix this embarrassment. Because that's what this was to him. Not a near-death experience. An embarrassment. I don't care what protocol says. I want her arrested the moment we land. She assaulted me. She forced her way into the cockpit. She's saving your life, a woman across the aisle said quietly. Her voice was shaking, but there was steel underneath. That's what she's doing. Harlan's face flushed red. She's creating a scene, disrupting the crew. When we land, I'm filing a complaint with the FAA, the airline, and every media outlet I can find. This is unacceptable, letting passengers just take over the plane. 2 rows back, Trent Bishop had his phone out. Recording, always recording. Because even now, even as the plane descended toward the runway with one dead engine, his first instinct was content. Views, followers, he had filmed everything. The door opening, the woman entering the cockpit, the confrontation. And now he was narrating into his camera, his voice breathless with manufactured excitement. You guys, this is insane. Some random lady literally hijacked the plane. She's up there right now flying it. The pilots just let her take over. This is the craziest thing I've ever seen. If we survive this, this video is going to blow up. A few seats away, Alina Crawford clutched her pearl necklace like a talisman. Her lips were moving, but she wasn't praying. She was rehearsing the story she would tell at her next luncheon. How she had been on a plane where some deranged woman had forced her way into the cockpit. How she had been traumatized. How she would never fly commercial again. How this simply proved that standards had fallen. That the wrong people were being allowed in places they didn't belong. But in the cockpit, none of that mattered. Lyra was flying 200 feet, 100. She could see the runway threshold now, the painted numbers, the tire marks from 1,000 landings before this one. The plane was heavy, sluggish, fighting her, but she had flown worse aircraft in worse conditions. 50 feet. She pulled back slightly on the throttle, let the nose rise, felt for the ground. This was the moment where instinct and training merged, where you stopped thinking and started feeling. 30 feet, 20, 10. The main gear kissed the runway with a gentle bump. Then the nose gear settled. They were down, rolling, slowing. The emergency equipment raced alongside them, fire trucks and ambulances tracking their path, but there was no fire, no explosion, just a commercial aircraft, damaged but intact, coasting to a stop on the tarmac. Lyra set the parking brake, shut down the remaining engine, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash beginning, but her voice was steady when she picked up the PA microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground. Emergency personnel will be boarding to assist. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Short, professional, no dramatics, because that's not who she was. She stood from the pilot's seat. Her legs felt weak beneath her, the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. She had saved them. 300 people who would go home tonight, who would see their families, who would never know how close they had come to dying because of pride and incompetence. Voss was staring at her with something like awe. "Colonel, I don't know what to say. You saved us, all of us." Lyra nodded, acknowledging but not accepting praise, because praise felt wrong. She had just done what needed to be done, what she was trained to do. Captain Briggs sat motionless in his seat, his hands still trembling, his face pale. He hadn't spoken since she'd taken control, hadn't looked at her, and Lyra understood. She had seen it before, in men who realized they weren't as capable as they thought, men whose confidence was stripped away in a moment of truth. "Captain," she said quietly, "you're going to want to secure the cockpit. There's going to be a lot of questions." He nodded, mechanical, broken, the hero of his own story reduced to a supporting character in someone else's. Lyra stepped out of the cockpit and back into the cabin, and the moment she emerged, the world exploded. Passengers erupted into applause, not polite applause, wild, desperate, grateful applause. People were standing, despite the seatbelt sign still being illuminated, reaching out to touch her, to thank her, to assure themselves she was real. "You saved us," a woman sobbed, grabbing Lyra's hand. "You saved my baby, thank you, thank you." Lyra pulled her hand back gently, uncomfortable with the attention, with the emotion. She wasn't a hero, she was a pilot, and pilots did their job. But the crowd pressed closer. A man in row 20, a large biker type who had been crying moments before, simply nodded at her, a gesture of profound respect that carried more weight than any words. People were reaching out to touch her hoodie as she passed, like she was a religious icon, physical proof that she was real. And then she saw them, in first class, the people who had dismissed her, mocked her, treated her like she was nothing. Harlan Webb was standing now, his face red, his finger pointed at her like a weapon. "You had no right, no authority. I don't care if you think you're some kind of hero. You forced your way into that cockpit. You assaulted crew members. And when we land, I'm making sure you're—" "We did land," a voice interrupted, cold, furious. It was a businessman in row 5, someone who had watched everything. "Because of her, we landed because she saved us. And you're standing there threatening her. Are you insane?" Harlan sputtered. "That's not the point. The point is protocol, rules she broke." "She broke the rules that would have killed us," another passenger shouted, a woman in business class. "The pilots didn't know what to do. They were panicking. We all heard it. And she walked in there and saved us. So maybe you should sit down and be grateful you're alive." Trent still had his phone out, recording, capturing every moment, but now passengers were noticing, and they weren't happy about it. "Put the phone down," someone snarled. "This isn't content, these are people's lives." "It's a public space," Trent said defensively. "I have the right to." An older man reached over and knocked the phone from his hand. It clattered to the floor, screen cracking. "You have the right to shut up and be thankful that woman up there cared more about saving you than you care about anything except yourself." Alina Crawford was crying now, not from relief, from humiliation, because the social calculus had shifted. The woman she had dismissed was being celebrated, applauded, treated like a hero, while she, Alina, was just another passenger, Ordinary, forgettable, nothing. Aquila stood frozen in the galley, watching Lyra move through the cabin, watching the passengers reach out to her, thank her, and Aquila felt the weight of her earlier words pressing down on her chest. The dismissal, the contempt, the assumption that this woman in the gray hoodie couldn't possibly be anyone important. She had been so wrong, so catastrophically wrong. Lyra reached the emergency exit where paramedics were boarding. She was ready to step off, to disappear back into anonymity, because that's what she wanted. No attention, no questions, just to go home. But the paramedics weren't looking at the passengers. They were looking for her. Colonel Halden, the lead paramedic, stood at attention, military bearing. "We've been instructed to escort you off the aircraft, ma'am." Lyra frowned. "I'm fine, check the passengers." "Ma'am, those aren't my orders. You're to come with us now." And then she saw them. Through the windows, military vehicles on the tarmac, personnel in fatigues, a Black Hawk helicopter in the distance, rotors spinning. This wasn't a normal emergency response. Something else was happening, something she didn't understand yet. She glanced back at the cabin, at the passengers watching her, at Aquila, pale and silent, at Harlan, still sputtering about lawsuits, at the people who had dismissed her and the people who were now grateful. And she walked off the plane, into whatever was waiting. Why were military personnel surrounding a civilian aircraft? The tarmac was chaos, fire trucks positioned in a defensive perimeter, ambulances with lights flashing, police cruisers blocking access roads, but cutting through all of it, moving with purpose, was a column of military vehicles, Humvees, a tactical response truck, and personnel in fatigues who moved with the precision of people who didn't waste time on civilian emergencies. Lyra walked down the jet bridge, her gray hoodie flapping in the evening wind, her worn sneakers quiet on the metal surface. The paramedics flanked her, not escorting, guarding. She noticed the way their hands rested near their sidearms, the way their eyes scanned the perimeter. These weren't medical personnel. They were security. At the bottom of the stairs, a black SUV waited, its engine running, windows tinted, government plates, and standing beside it was a man Lyra hadn't seen in 4 years, General Marcus Hale, 2 stars on his collar, commander of Marine Fighter Attack Operations, her former commanding officer. He saluted her, sharp, crisp, right there on the civilian tarmac. Lyra returned it, casual but respectful. "Sir, this seems like a lot of firepower for a routine emergency landing." "Get in the vehicle, Colonel. We'll talk inside." It wasn't a request. Lyra climbed into the back seat. The general followed. The door closed with the heavy thunk of armored plating. The SUV pulled away immediately, leaving the circus of the emergency response behind. Inside, the general studied her, taking in the hoodie, the exhaustion in her eyes, the dried blood on her knuckles from when she'd pounded on the cockpit door. He said nothing for a long moment, just watched her with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You've been off the grid for 2 years, he finally said. "Inactive reserve, no contact, no response to our attempts to reach you. And then you show up here on a civilian flight, taking control of an aircraft in a crisis situation." Lyra looked out the window, watching the airport pass by. "I was flying home to visit my mother. The plane had an emergency. I helped. That's all." "That's not all." The general pulled out a tablet, brought up a file. 30 minutes ago, satellite telemetry picked up an unauthorized military override command from that aircraft, a system that only activates when specific biometric and clearance criteria are met, a system designed for combat scenarios where pilots need emergency access to commandeered or captured aircraft. Lyra felt her stomach tighten. "I didn't know that system existed on civilian planes." "It doesn't officially." The general's eyes were hard. "But 6 years ago, after the incident in Syria, certain protocols were updated for pilots with your clearance level, your biometric signature, your operational history. The system recognized you, Colonel, and it opened that door because it determined you were needed. I don't understand. Why would? Because you're not just any pilot. The general leaned forward. You're a pilot who has been flagged for potential recall, at any time, under any circumstances. Your clearance never expired, Lyra. It was elevated. You're on a very short list of people this country can't afford to lose, and when that system detected you near a crisis situation, it activated. Lyra stared at him, processing. You've been tracking me the whole time. We've been aware of your location. Yes, not tracking, monitoring, there's a difference. Not to me. Lyra's voice was cold. I left. I resigned my commission. I wanted a normal life. You requested inactive reserve status. That's not the same as leaving. And given your operational record, your skill set, the missions you've completed, the general paused. You were never going to get a normal life, Lyra. People like you don't get that option. The SUV turned onto a restricted access road, away from the commercial terminals, toward the military section of the airport. Lyra saw the chain-link fences, the guard towers, the warning signs about restricted airspace. Where are you taking me? Debriefing, standard protocol after an incident like this. The FAA is going to have questions, the airline is going to have questions, and frankly, so do I, because what you did up there. He shook his head. Single-engine landing, after recovering from a deep stall, with untrained crew fighting you. Most pilots would have crashed, but you didn't. You brought them down like you were landing an F-22 on a carrier deck in a hurricane. I did what I was trained to do. Exactly, and that's why we need to talk, because someone with your training, your instincts, your command presence. You don't belong on a commercial flight in economy class. You belong in a cockpit, our cockpit. Lyra felt the weight of those words, the pressure, the expectation, the assumption that she would just slip back into the uniform, back into the life she'd tried to leave behind. I'm done, she said quietly. I did my time. I saved people today because they needed saving, but that doesn't mean I'm coming back. The general was quiet for a moment. Then he handed her the tablet. On the screen was a video, grainy, time-stamped, taken from a passenger's phone. It showed Lyra entering the cockpit, showed her taking control, showed the plane descending, and at the bottom of the screen a news ticker was already running. Mystery hero pilot SAVES 300 lives. Who is she? You're already viral, the general said. Every news outlet in the country is running this story. By tomorrow morning, your face will be on every screen. Your name will be everywhere. The airline is trying to spin it. Some passengers are calling you a hero. Others are demanding you be arrested for violating federal regulations. It's a mess. Lyra's jaw tightened. I didn't ask for this. No one ever does, but here we are. And now you have a choice. You can go back to your life, try to disappear into the noise, deal with the lawsuits and the media circus and the people who think you're a criminal for saving their lives. Or, he paused, you can come back, officially, full reinstatement, full rank, full protection under military regulations that shield you from civilian prosecution for actions taken during a crisis. That's not a choice, that's blackmail. That's reality. The general's voice wasn't cruel, just honest. You're good at what you do, Lyra, too good. And this country needs people like you, especially now. Tensions are rising, conflicts are escalating, and we're short on pilots who can think under pressure, who can lead, who can make the impossible look routine. The SUV stopped. They were at a hangar. Inside, Lyra could see an F-22 Raptor sitting under bright lights, her aircraft, or one exactly like it. The sight of it sent a surge of something through her chest, not nostalgia, something deeper, recognition, like seeing an old friend after years apart. Think about it, the general said. Take tonight, tomorrow. But understand, Lyra, that the world knows what you can do now, and they're not going to forget. Neither will we. He opened the door, stepped out, left Lyra sitting in the back seat, staring at that fighter jet through the windshield, staring at the life she tried to leave, The life that had just pulled her back in, whether she wanted it or not. Back on the commercial aircraft, things were unraveling. Captain Briggs sat in the cockpit, his hands still shaking, staring at the now silent instruments. The FAA investigators had already boarded. They were downloading the flight data recorder, pulling audio logs, asking questions he couldn't answer, because every answer made him look worse. Yes, he had fought the controls during a stall. Yes, he had refused to listen to the woman who tried to help. Yes, he had called her a random passenger, dismissed her warnings, and nearly killed everyone because his pride wouldn't let him accept that someone else might know better. The lead investigator looked at him with barely concealed contempt. "Captain, I'm going to be very clear with you. Your handling of this incident was catastrophic. We have audio of you actively fighting against corrective measures. We have telemetry showing you pulling back into a stall while Lieutenant Colonel Halden was trying to recover. And we have testimony from your first officer that he had to disable your controls to prevent you from crashing this aircraft." Briggs said nothing. What could he say? That he hadn't known, that he'd panicked, that he couldn't accept a woman in a hoodie was more qualified than him. "You're grounded," the investigator continued, "pending formal review, but I can tell you right now, Captain, you're never flying commercially again. This is over." In the cabin, passengers were being interviewed. Some were still crying, still processing how close they'd come, but others were angry, angry at the crew, angry at the airline, angry that they'd been put in danger by incompetence. Harlan Webb was the loudest, still demanding that someone arrest Lyra, still insisting that rules had been broken, that protocols had been violated, but now other passengers were pushing back, hard. "She saved your life," a woman shouted at him, "and you're standing there trying to get her in trouble. What's wrong with you?" "It's not about gratitude," Harlan snapped. "It's about order, rules. If we just let people do whatever they want." She didn't do whatever she wanted. She did what needed to be done. And the only reason you're alive to complain about it is because she was better at her job than the people getting paid to do it. The argument escalated, voices rising, security stepping in. And Harlan realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that his money and his status didn't make him right. They just made him loud. Trent Bishop was frantically trying to salvage his footage. His phone was cracked, but the video was intact, and he was already editing, adding captions, creating a narrative where he was the victim, where he was the one who documented this insanity. But as he scrolled through the comments already flooding in on his earlier posts, he saw something that made his blood run cold. People weren't praising him. They were attacking him, calling him a vulture, saying he cared more about views than lives, demanding he take the video down. His sponsors were already pulling out. His follower count was dropping, because the internet had turned on him, and once that happened, there was no coming back. Alina Crawford sat alone in her seat, still clutching her pearls, realizing that the story she'd planned to tell at her next luncheon would never be told, because she would never be invited again, because the people she surrounded herself with had seen the video, seen her condescension, seen her dismissal of the woman who saved her, and they had judged her, found her wanting. And Aquila Danner stood in the galley, watching investigators move through the cabin, knowing that her career was over too. Not because she'd done anything illegal, but because she'd done something unforgivable. She dismissed a decorated combat veteran. She'd treated her like trash, and everyone had seen it. The plane was empty now, except for the ghosts of choices and consequences that would haunt everyone who'd been on board. What do you do when the world suddenly sees you? Lyra spent the night in a military debriefing room. Spartan, functional, a table, 2 chairs, fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally. She'd been in rooms like this before, after missions, after incidents that required explanation. But this time felt different. This time she wasn't being debriefed as a Marine pilot. She was being questioned as a civilian who had taken actions that violated a dozen federal regulations. The FAA investigator sat across from her. A woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen too many crashes. She had a folder in front of her, thick, full of incident reports and testimonies and the kind of documentation that could destroy a person's life. "Colonel Halden, I want to be very clear about something," the investigator began. "What you did today saved 300 lives. I'm not disputing that. But you also violated federal aviation regulations. You forced entry into a secure cockpit. You physically interfered with a commercial pilot. You took control of an aircraft without authorization from the crew or air traffic control. These are serious offenses." Lyra sat with her hands folded on the table, calm. "The door opened on its own. I didn't force anything. The door opened because of a military override system that you triggered. I didn't know I triggered it. I didn't even know it existed." The investigator studied her. "But you knew something was wrong with the aircraft. You identified a compressor stall before the pilots did. You moved forward to the cockpit with intention. You weren't just a concerned passenger. You were acting on training and expertise that far exceeded the crew's capability." "Yes." "So you knew what you were doing. You knew you could help, and you made a choice to intervene." "I made a choice to save people." Lyra's voice was steady. "If that's a crime, charge me. But don't sit there and pretend that following protocol would have been better when protocol would have resulted in a crash." The investigator leaned back, sighed. "It's not that simple, because now we have a precedent. We have passengers seeing your actions and thinking that if something goes wrong, they can just take over. We have pilots questioning their authority. We have airlines terrified that any flight could turn into a free-for-all if someone decides they know better." "Then maybe pilots should know better," Lyra said quietly. "Maybe if Captain Briggs had listened when I warned him about the engine, none of this would have happened. Maybe if he hadn't panicked. Maybe if his ego hadn't gotten in the way of his training. Maybe then I wouldn't have needed to intervene." The investigator didn't argue. She couldn't, because the flight data recorder backed up every word Lyra said. The audio logs were damning. Captain Briggs had received multiple warnings from instruments, from his first officer, from Lyra, and he'd ignored them all because he couldn't accept that he was wrong. "The airline wants to press charges," the investigator said. "Interference with a flight crew, unauthorized access to a cockpit. They're arguing that your actions, regardless of the outcome, created a dangerous precedent." "The airline wants to cover their ass," Lyra said flatly. "They know Briggs screwed up. They know their training program failed. And they'd rather make me the villain than admit their pilot nearly killed 300 people because he couldn't handle being corrected by a woman." The investigator's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Off the record, Colonel, you're absolutely right. And off the record, the NTSB is going to bury Captain Briggs. His career is over. But officially, I have to document this. I have to make recommendations. And those recommendations are going to include a review of protocols for passenger intervention in emergencies." "Good," Lyra said. "Because maybe the next time someone knows how to save a plane full of people, they won't have to fight through a locked door and a captain's ego to do it." The investigator closed her folder, stood. "You're free to go, Colonel. No charges will be filed. The military has formally invoked jurisdiction over your actions, citing emergency combat protocols. The airline is furious, but there's nothing they can do. You're protected." Lyra stood as well. "I didn't ask for protection." "No, but you're getting it anyway. Because whether you like it or not, you're a national story now. And the military doesn't let its heroes get crucified by bureaucrats." Lyra walked out of that room into a different world. While she'd been in debriefing, the media had exploded. Her name had been leaked. Her military record, or at least parts of it, had been confirmed. And the narrative had crystallized. Marine hero, SAVES flight after pilots fail. Combat veteran takes control in mid-air emergency. F F-22 pilot lands civilian aircraft with one engine. The headlines were everywhere, on news sites, on social media, on television broadcasts that showed the grainy passenger footage of her entering the cockpit. Her face was pixelated in most of the shots, but people knew who she was now, and they had opinions. Some called her a hero, a warrior, someone who embodied courage and competence. Others called her reckless, dangerous, someone who had no right to interfere with trained professionals. The debate raged across every platform, every comment section, every talking head news show. But Lyra didn't see any of it, because the moment she left the debriefing room, the general was waiting, and he had new orders. "You're being extracted," he said. "Tonight, we're moving you to a secure location until this dies down. The media is camped outside your mother's house. They're at your last known address. They're everywhere. If you go back to civilian life right now, you won't have a civilian life. It'll be cameras and questions and lawsuits and chaos." "I can handle it," Lyra said. "I'm sure you can, but you shouldn't have to, not after what you did today." He handed her a folder. "Full reinstatement, Lieutenant Colonel, active duty, effective immediately. You'll be assigned to a training command, teaching the next generation of fighter pilots. No deployments, no combat missions unless you request them, just flying, and teaching people to fly the way you do." Lyra stared at the folder, at the papers inside, at the signature line waiting for her, and she felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. The military was offering her protection, purpose, a place where she belonged, but it was also asking her to give up the life she'd been trying to build, the quiet, the anonymity, the freedom to be something other than a warrior. "What if I say no?" she asked. "Then you walk away, and you deal with the consequences alone, the lawsuits, the media, the airline trying to make you a scapegoat, the passengers who want to thank you and the ones who want to see you prosecuted, all of it, without support, without protection. Because once you're no longer military, we can't shield you, and the people who want to hurt you will have a clear shot." It was the same choice the general had presented earlier, only now it was more urgent, more real, because the world was watching, and the world didn't forgive, it didn't forget, it just consumed and moved on. Lyra thought about her mother, living alone in that small house, her health declining, her memory fading. Lyra had been flying home to see her, to help her, to be the daughter she'd tried to be despite everything else. And now, because of one emergency landing, that was being taken away. "If I sign this," Lyra said slowly, "I need guarantees, my mother's safety, her medical care, privacy for her. She doesn't deserve to have cameras in her face because of my decisions." "Done. We'll place her in a protected care facility. Best medical staff in the country, no media access, and you'll be able to visit her regularly. Under escort, but you'll see her." Lyra looked at the folder again, at the life it represented, the uniforms, the protocols, the structure that both confined and protected her, and she thought about what the alternative looked like. Chaos, lawsuits, a life defined by one moment, one crisis, one choice. She picked up the pen, and she signed. Back on the commercial aircraft, now empty and dark, maintenance crews were inspecting the damage. The left engine was destroyed, completely unsalvageable. When they opened the cowling, they found turbine blades sheared off, mounting bolts fractured, oil lines ruptured. It was a miracle the engine hadn't exploded, a miracle it had held together long enough for Lyra to shut it down. The lead mechanic whistled low. If this had gone another 30 seconds, the whole thing would have come apart, taken the wing with it. Fuel lines would have ruptured. We'd be looking at a fireball, not a landing. His team worked in silence, documenting, photographing, understanding how close it had been, how thin the margin between survival and disaster, and in their professional assessment, one thing was clear. The woman who had taken control had saved that aircraft. Not just the passengers, the entire aircraft, because a crash at altitude would have scattered wreckage across miles, would have killed people on the ground, would have been a catastrophe measured in years of investigation and blame. She had prevented all of that, and most people would never know how close they'd come. In the days that followed, the consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Captain Briggs was formally grounded, his pilot's license suspended pending investigation. His union tried to defend him, arguing that anyone could panic in an emergency, that hindsight was unfair, that he'd been put in an impossible situation. But the flight data recorder didn't lie, and neither did the audio logs. First Officer Voss quietly resigned. He couldn't face flying again, couldn't face the cockpit where he'd frozen, where his training had failed, where he'd been saved by a passenger he'd underestimated. He moved back to his hometown, took a job teaching at a local community college, and every time a plane flew overhead, he looked up and wondered if he'd ever have the courage to sit in a cockpit again. Aquila Danner was reassigned, demoted, no longer lead flight attendant, no longer working the premium routes. She was sent to the red-eye budget flights, the ones where passengers were cramped and angry and treated crew like servants, and she learned slowly what it felt like to be dismissed, to be treated like she was less than, to have her expertise ignored because of how she looked or where she stood. It humbled her. It broke something in her that needed to be broken, and eventually it rebuilt her into someone different, someone who saw people instead of seats, someone who understood that respect wasn't earned by uniform or position. It was given, or withheld, based on how you treated others. Harlan Webb's business partners saw the footage, the viral video that Trent Bishop had accidentally uploaded before the crash. It showed Harlan throwing peanuts, slurring insults, dismissing a decorated veteran, and his board of directors made a calculation, a cold, corporate calculation about reputation and liability in public relations. They voted him out, citing reputational damage. His wife left him. The divorce was quick and brutal. She took the house, the kids, the assets, and Harlan was left with his pride, his arrogance, his belief that his money and status made him untouchable. But they didn't, and he became the very thing he'd mocked, irrelevant. Trent Bishop tried to spin the narrative, tried to edit the footage to make himself look heroic, the guy who documented the crisis, the citizen journalist, but the internet saw through it. They saw the fear in his voice, the way he'd abandoned helping for filming, the way he'd cared more about views than the people around him. His sponsors dropped him, his follower count plummeted, he was doxxed, harassed. His face became a meme for superficial cruelty, for performative concern that masked genuine selfishness. He deleted his accounts, vanished, and the internet moved on to the next target. But they never forgot what he represented. Elena Crawford's social circle evaporated. The high society she'd worshipped had no use for a woman who'd been publicly exposed as cruel. She was uninvited from events, ignored at functions. The pearls she loved so much became a symbol of her disgrace. She spent her days alone in her empty mansion, understanding too late that wealth couldn't buy character, couldn't buy redemption, could only buy silence from people who no longer cared what she had to say. And Lyra Haldon, she put on the uniform again, returned to the life she tried to leave, not because she wanted to, but because the world had decided who she was, and fighting that decision was a battle she couldn't win. She reported to base 3 days later, her hair pulled back, her uniform pressed, her bearing that of someone who had never stopped being a Marine, even when she tried. What does dignity look like when it refuses to speak? 3 months after the emergency landing, Lyra stood in the briefing room at Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort. In front of her sat 30 young pilots, fresh from flight school, eager, nervous, ready to learn how to fly the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. And sitting in the back row, taking notes quietly, was First Officer Voss. He'd requested permission to attend, to observe, to understand what he'd missed when panic had taken over. The Marine Corps had granted it, because Voss had done something rare. He'd admitted failure, and he'd asked for help. Lyra didn't acknowledge him directly, but she knew he was there. And when she spoke, her words were for all of them. The young pilots who thought they knew everything, and the experienced officer who'd learned he didn't. "Flying isn't about never being afraid," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet room. "It's about what you do when fear shows up. Do you let it control you? Do you let it make you freeze? Or do you acknowledge it, set it aside, and do your job?" She pulled up a slide, showed them the image of the commercial aircraft, the one she'd landed, the one that had made her famous against her will. Some of you have seen the video, some of you know the story, and some of you are sitting there thinking, I would have done the same thing. But here's what I need you to understand. The reason that landing worked wasn't because I'm special, it's because I've trained for worse. I've landed jets on one engine under fire. I've flown missions where mechanical failure wasn't a possibility, it was a guarantee at some point. And I survived because I didn't rely on hope. I relied on procedure, on training, on the fundamentals that don't change whether you're in a fighter jet or a commercial airliner. The young pilots were riveted, but Lyra saw something else in their eyes: hero worship. The same look passengers had given her when she stepped out of the cockpit, and she needed to kill that, because hero worship was dangerous. It made people complacent, made them think that talent was a substitute for discipline. "You want to know why Captain Briggs failed?" she said bluntly. "Not because he was a bad pilot, but because he'd spent 30 years flying and forgotten what it felt like to be wrong. He'd stopped questioning himself, stopped listening to people who might know better, and when the crisis came, his instincts failed him, because instincts without training are just panic with a different name." She clicked to the next slide, showed them the flight data, the altitude loss, the stall recovery, the single-engine approach, and she walked them through it, step by step. No heroics, just procedure, just the mechanics of survival. "This is what saved those people," she said. "Not courage, not instinct, just training executed under pressure. And that's what you're here to learn: how to execute when everything is falling apart, how to think when your body wants to scream, how to make the right decision when every option looks wrong." After the briefing, Voss approached her, hesitant, uncertain. He'd lost weight since the incident. His eyes had dark circles beneath them. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in months. "Colonel Halden," he began, "I wanted to thank you for what you did, and to apologize for not listening sooner, for freezing when I should have acted." Lyra looked at him, this man who'd had his career destroyed by one moment of panic, and she saw herself in him, because she'd frozen too, once, early in her career, on a training mission when her aircraft had malfunctioned and she'd spent 3 seconds paralyzed by fear, 3 seconds that felt like eternity, before training kicked in and she recovered. "You're here," she said simply. "That means you haven't quit. Most people would have walked away, would have let that moment define them, but you're here, trying to learn. That takes courage too." Voss nodded, his throat tight. "I don't know if I'll ever fly again, but I needed to understand what happened, why I failed, what I missed." "You didn't trust yourself," Lyra said. "You had the knowledge, the training, but when the captain fought you, you doubted. You thought maybe he knew something you didn't. Maybe his experience meant more than your instincts. And by the time you realized you were right, it was almost too late. How do you? How do you trust yourself when someone with more experience is telling you you're wrong? You verify, you check your instruments, you listen to the aircraft. And if everything is telling you one thing and the person next to you is saying something else, you make a choice. Because in a cockpit there's no democracy. There's physics. And physics doesn't care about rank or experience. It only cares about what's true." Voss absorbed that. Then he asked the question that had been haunting him. "Would you have done what I did, disconnecting the captain's controls?" Lyra was quiet for a moment, considering. "I would have done it sooner, because that captain wasn't just wrong, he was killing people. And when someone's pride is more dangerous than the crisis itself, you don't ask for permission, you act." She saw the weight of that land on him, the understanding that he'd done the right thing, but only after precious seconds were lost. seconds that could have cost lives. The military protected you, Voss said. They invoked jurisdiction, shielded you from prosecution. But if you hadn't been military, you'd be facing charges right now. Doesn't that bother you, that doing the right thing could destroy your life? Every day, Lyra admitted. But I didn't do it for protection. I did it because it needed to be done. And if the system wants to punish people for saving lives, then the system is broken. But I'm not going to stop acting just because the rules are wrong. She turned to leave, then paused. Voss, you asked if you'll ever fly again. The answer is yes. If you want to, but not because you need to prove something. Fly because you understand what went wrong, because you've learned from it, because you're not the same person who froze in that cockpit. And when you do fly again, remember this: confidence without humility is arrogance, and arrogance kills. In the months that followed, the public slowly lost interest in the story. New crises emerged, new heroes, new villains. The viral video of Lyra entering the cockpit was replaced by other content. The debates about passenger intervention faded as regulations were updated and airlines implemented new protocols. But for the people who'd been on that flight, the memory never faded. Some of them reached out to Lyra, sent letters, thanked her, told her about their children who wouldn't exist if she hadn't acted, about the weddings they attended, the birthdays they celebrated, the moments they experienced because she'd given them a future. Lyra read every letter, but she didn't respond, because she didn't do it for gratitude. She did it because it was who she was, and that had to be enough. The airline quietly settled with the passengers, paid out millions in compensation, revised their training programs, implemented new protocols for crew communication and crisis management, and they never publicly acknowledged that their pilot had nearly killed 300 people because his ego wouldn't let him accept help from a woman in a gray hoodie. But the pilots knew. In ready rooms and crew lounges and training facilities, they talked about Captain Briggs, about the woman who'd saved his passengers despite him. And slowly, the culture began to shift, because fear was a powerful teacher, and the fear of being the next Briggs made people listen a little more carefully when someone challenged them. Lyra flew again, not in combat but in training missions, teaching young pilots how to handle the impossible, how to think when the aircraft was screaming at them, how to trust their training when their instincts were wrong. And she was good at it because she understood failure. She'd seen it, felt it, survived it. One afternoon, 6 months after the incident, she was approached by a young female pilot, fresh out of flight school, nervous but determined. "Colonel Halden," the pilot said, I wanted to thank you, not just for what you did on that flight, but for being here, for showing us that we belong in these cockpits, because I grew up being told women can't fly fighters, can't handle the pressure, can't lead. And then I saw you, and I knew it was possible." Lyra studied her, this young woman who thought she needed permission to be great, and she remembered what it felt like, to be dismissed, to be doubted, to prove yourself over and over and still have people question whether you belonged. "You don't need me to show you that," Lyra said. "You need to show yourself, because the moment you start flying to prove something to other people, you've already lost. Fly because you're good at it. Fly because you love it. Fly because when you're up there, everything else stops mattering, and if people doubt you, let them. Their doubt is their problem, not yours." The young pilot nodded, understanding, and Lyra saw something in her eyes, the same fire she'd once had, the same determination, the same refusal to be limited by other people's expectations. And she knew that pilot would be fine, because she'd already made the most important decision, to keep flying, despite the doubt, despite the barriers, despite everything. 2 years after the emergency landing, Lyra received a letter. It was from Aquila Danner, the flight attendant who'd dismissed her, who'd told her to sit down, who'd treated her like she was nothing. The letter was simple, handwritten, no excuses, no justifications, just an apology for the assumptions she'd made, for the cruelty she'd shown, for the moment when her prejudice had almost cost lives. At the end, Aquila wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that you changed me. What you did that day and how you treated me after when you had every right to be angry. It showed me who I was, and I didn't like what I saw, so I'm trying to be different, better. Thank you for saving us, not just from the crash, but from ourselves." Lyra folded the letter, put it away, and she felt something she hadn't expected, not satisfaction, not vindication, just a quiet understanding that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to be permanent, that grace, when offered, could transform. She never responded to the letter, but she kept it, because it reminded her that the hardest battles weren't fought in the sky. They were fought in quiet moments, in choices, in the decision to be kind when you had every right to be cruel, in the choice to act when it would be easier to walk away. Years later, when Lyra's military career finally ended and she retired with full honors, she returned to civilian life. Not in hiding this time, but quietly. She bought a small house near the ocean, spent her days walking the beach, reading, flying small planes for the joy of it rather than the mission. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the sky was clear, she would look up and see contrails cutting across the blue, jets flying high above, and she would wonder if one of those pilots was someone she'd trained, someone who remembered her lessons, someone who would act when others froze, who would listen when pride said to be deaf, who would save lives because it was right, not because it was easy. The world had tried to make her a hero, but Lyra had never wanted that. Heroes were myths, legends, stories people told to make themselves feel better about their own inaction. She was just a pilot, someone who'd been trained to fly, to think, to act, and when the moment came, she'd done what she was trained to do. Nothing more, nothing less. And in the end, that was the truest victory of all. Not the headlines, not the recognition, not the gratitude of strangers, but the quiet knowledge that when it mattered most, she'd been exactly who she needed to be. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.